It can sometimes feel like everyone who grew up in the 1990s is obsessed with that era. I mean, okay, if you've seen any of my videos, you know that I'm just as guilty. But it really was a special time, particularly for gaming, sports, and entertainment. And there's one year that always stands out to me, 1993. This was the year that gave us Doom, Rocko's Modern Life, Deep Space Nine, and the rise of the internet. It was the end of Jordan's golden era and the beginning of Shaq's. But it was also the year that forever elevated sports games from this to this.
Here's the tip. For two. Is it the shoes? Kaboom! They need a shot here. Boom shakalaka!
When NBA Jam came out and Chaos dunked on my childhood, it set the sports world on fire.
This is bad, man. This is bad.
No one had seen anything like this before, and Midway knew it. Before 1993, sports games had mostly been slow, methodical simulations. But now there was this exaggerated realism of lifelike NBA players making insane dunks. It was so radically different that it felt like Midway had created a new video game genre overnight. The origins of this over-the-top approach had been seen much earlier, but it was Jam that tied the best elements together, and added an unprecedented level of polish. And with the help of some successful console ports, phrases like
Boom shakalaka!
and
He's on fire!
were securely planted in the cultural lexicon. But before I get into the cheat codes and all that fun stuff, it is important to understand what contributed to Jam's success. So, time for some history. During the 1980s, the general state of sports games was not very good. There was Tecmo Bowl and ice hockey, but basketball games were especially tricky because they relied on more complex physics coding. As a result, you had stuff like this. But 1984 saw an interesting development with Super Basketball by Konami. You can see the court scrolls side to side for the first time ever, and the hardware manages to pull it off with a solid frame rate. But despite this, there is a lot happening on the court. With that many playable characters on the screen, it's easy for things to get confusing. 2 years later, GBA Championship Basketball tried something new, cutting the game down to just 2 players per team, 1 player to shoot and 1 to pass to. There's no scrolling this time around, but 2-on-2 gameplay is a much better fit for 2-player gaming. Fast forward another couple of years, and we have Slam Dunk for the Commodore 64 personal computer. It was actually pretty ahead of its time. Like Jam, it has parallax side-scrolling, you can foul other players, and you can even break the backboard. That's pretty good for 1988, but the hardware inside of the Commodore 64 was 6 years old by this point. By the time people had figured out how to push the system to its limits, the 90s were already in full swing. Regardless, the 80s still had plenty of awesome sports games, so let me know what some of your favorites are in the comments. Anyway, just 1 year after Slam Dunk, Midway released their first sports arcade cabinet, Arch Rivals. This had unique playable characters and better animation than anything that had come before it. Because it was running on arcade hardware and not a home computer, it was able to push the envelope a bit, and gameplay was much faster. Arch Rivals' larger-than-life, cartoonish style was definitely more fun, but it was still limited in some ways. You can see the court looks pretty basic, with a lower pixel density for some reason, and the entire background is just empty, and the stands aren't very filled out either. It just doesn't have the feel of a real NBA court. In order for that to happen, Midway would have to rely on some pretty cutting-edge technology, digitizing real footage to put into a video game. This method of realism was, again, not a new thing. Going back to 1983, Midway was actually the first developer to use this technique in a widely released game. Journey, based on the popular rock band, features digitized photograph cutouts of the band members. It was a pretty small step forward by today's standards, but the potential was clearly there. It would take a few years for the trend to pick up steam, but in 1988, Narc took this technique to its logical conclusion. The characters and level design were more or less all digitized from real photography, which made for a unique and violent run-and-gun arcade game. Narc had finally set off the digitized graphics craze. It quickly caught the attention of artist John Tobias and game designer Mark Turmell, both of whom had worked for Midway on a game called Smash TV. After seeing firsthand what digitized graphics could do for games, Tobias and Turmell split off to kickstart their own project ideas. Tobias would go on to co-create Mortal Kombat with game designer Ed Boon, making use of photographed actors to create a realistic arcade fighter. But Turmel had other plans. He was a basketball fan at heart, and he saw the rise of this new technology as an opportunity to innovate a neglected market. The result was an experience that changed everything people thought they knew about sports games. It was the first of its kind in many of the ways that I've just described, but it also set a precedent for cheat codes. Case in point, Big Head Mode. Although it's probably best known in games like GoldenEye 007 on the N64, it was NBA Jam that started the trend. Big Head Mode, like a number of other cheats, is activated at this matchup loading screen. When it appears, just push the joystick up and then hold down the steel and turbo buttons. Once the match starts, your character will have an oversized head. It's a simple graphical tweak, but the term and its effects have endured for decades. Now, Big Head Mode is interesting for a number of reasons, which you can learn all about in my previous video, but there's a little more information that I can add to this. I reached out to programmer Sean Liptak, who was responsible for coding many of Jam's popular features, and this is what he had to say.
Big Head Mode was an easy thing to do. We had a new graphics chip that was available maybe like the beginning of the project. So that is what we used to make the characters get smaller in the background and larger in the foreground. It was all done through sprite scaling. The same art, it just scaled up and down. And the heads were attached to the bodies, and the heads scaled with the body, proportionally. I don't remember if it started as a bug or, hey, look, this head's twice as big. That's funny. And then someone decides we could make that a feature, a cheat code, whatever.
So aside from just being a random feature in the game, Big Head Mode and cheat codes in general were a marketing tool that Midway and other developers used very effectively. For example, the Sega Genesis version of Mortal Kombat was actually advertised with a cheat code that would add blood and violent fatalities to the game. NBA Jam also used cheat codes as a form of promotion, just without the violent content. Most of them are pretty straightforward, giving players a competitive edge over other characters, but there are other cheat codes that offer a look behind the scenes at how the game functions. At the matchup screen, rotate the joystick and press any combination of buttons 21 times. This will let you see the shot percentage, essentially how likely it is that any given shot you take will go in. Of course, it's handy to know your likelihood of success when you want to throw that last-second Hail Mary from across the court. But this cheat also opens a small window into the AI running in the background. I'll let Sean explain this a little bit more.
When you went to shoot the ball, it actually shot the ball probably like a dozen different times. It made virtual shots of the ball with different random offsets, and it would run this simulation of the ball hitting the rim and the backboard. Because, basically it was all percentage driven. So if you were taking a three-pointer and we were like, yeah, this should only go in 20% of the time, when the simulations ran, it would be like, okay, this should not go in, but it needs to look cool while it's not going in. So we run all these simulations to try to give you the most exciting shots.
There is another hidden feature I want to talk about. It's not activated with a cheat code, but rather simply by selecting certain teams. So in the early 90s, there was this intense rivalry between the Chicago Bulls and the Detroit Pistons. And being a diehard Pistons fan, lead designer Mark Turmel actually coded a bias into NBA Jam. To quote, "If there was a close game and anyone on the Bulls took a last-second shot, we wrote special code in the game so that they would average out to be bricks." There was the big competition back in the day between the Pistons and the Bulls, and since I was always a big Pistons fan, that was my opportunity to level the playing field. Hidden features like this add more variety to the gameplay and allow players to customize their experiences. But what if you want to play a different game altogether? Well, as it turns out, there's actually a separate minigame coded right into NBA Jam. Once again, at the matchup screen, hold all of the joysticks down and hold down all of the buttons. You'll no longer be playing basketball, but a recreation of Battlezone, the classic 1980 first-person shooter. This minigame only lasts for about a minute, but if you're able to survive the onslaught of enemies, you'll be rewarded by activating every cheat in the game at once. It's actually pretty fun on its own, but it did cause some issues for some arcade owners. After finding this tank game, some clever players found out that they could actually play this game without spending any money.
When you were starting the game up and picking your characters, it did the check there to see if you were pushing the sticks. I think buttons had to be in whatever the combination was, and that would trigger the tank game. The problem was, during the attract mode, it did the same check. It was never disabled in that case. So people could sit there watching the attract mode and then wait for it and hold the sticks, and they could launch the tank game and play it for 1 minute, and then it would go back to the attract mode.
Fortunately, no real damage was done. This minigame could only be played for a minute at a time. Plus, Midway was quick to correct the issue in later versions of the game. But with all of these cheat codes floating around, there was something even they couldn't plan for. Before the widespread use of the internet, when a new game came out, players often had to discover cheat codes on their own. Of course, this isn't a bad thing for arcades because more time spent on a game means more revenue. But for some players, figuring out cheat codes eventually turned into an alternate revenue stream. These kids would type out and sell lists of codes they had found for up to $5 to $10 a pop. Now, you might be thinking, who would pay this kind of money just to see players with bigger heads and 60 seconds of a tank game? And fair enough, but I haven't even touched on the most popular hidden feature of the game, the secret characters. Aside from the 54 licensed NBA players, there are 13 additional characters in the original release of NBA Jam. Most of these are people who worked on the game itself. For example, Mark Turmell is in it, and so is Sean Liptak. But you can also play as the models who were used to capture the movements for all the playable characters. One of them is Stephen Howard, who started his career in the NBA that same year. Many of these characters also have better stats than the regular players. For example, Turmell is statistically the best player in the game. So it's not really surprising that kids capitalized on this and sold their code lists to anyone wanting a leg up in the game. But how these characters are unlocked is just as interesting as the characters themselves. Up to this point, arcade games would have players enter their name or initials in order to preserve their high score. But NBA Jam uses initials and birth dates, so players can create unique profiles, saving their stats onto the arcade machine to use later. To that end, typing MJT for Mark J. Turmell and entering March 22nd for the birthday will unlock Turmell as a playable character. Every hidden character is accessed with this input method, another first for video games. But the notion of unlocking hidden characters went even further when Turmell and fellow developer Sal DeVita started promoting the game. Shortly after Jam's release, an alleged screenshot had surfaced and was being circulated by game magazines. It showed an in-game cheerleader and Playboy bunny Carrie Hoskins performing a flaming dunk. It turned out to be a clever marketing spin to get people to play the game and try to figure out how to unlock more secret characters. But it also had some unforeseen consequences. Before long, kids were calling Midway and Playboy and even Hoskins' private residence looking for these unlock codes. But sadly, there were no super secret characters. Sal DeVita would go on to confirm this at GDC 2018.
We didn't know how to say no to people, so they would ask us, are there codes for the cheerleaders?
Yeah.
Can you unlock the cheerleaders? We're like, yeah, you can, yeah.
So Carrie Hoskins may not have been in the original NBA Jam, but she did become a hidden character in NBA Jam Tournament Edition. This was a full system upgrade that was released the following year. Early versions of the game actually included some Mortal Kombat characters and the ability to perform fatalities on other players when pushing them. But after showing off this roster to the NBA, Midway had to remove the more problematic secret characters, which included the Grim Reaper. The home console versions of the game also have a pretty wild spread of cheat codes and hidden characters. Let me know what some of your favorites are, and maybe I'll do a separate video on them. Anyway, all of this culminates in NBA Jam being pretty much the perfect time capsule of the 1990s. It contains all of the attitude, the larger-than-life characters, and ultimately the spirit of what made this era so special. But don't take my word for it. The echoes of its influence remain over 25 years after its release. So if NBA Jam doesn't stand the test of time, well, I don't know what does. I want to take a moment to thank new Patreon subscribers Akaz, Brent, Derek, Michael, Rick, and Skylar. The extra support really means a lot. If you want to get involved in the conversation, drop a comment on the video or join us in the Discord chat. Anyway, my name's Kyle, and this has been Codex. Thanks for watching.